My friends, let me start with a question that should unsettle you. How many mistakes can a society make before it collapses under the weight of its own errors? History is filled with examples. Rome, Britain, Spain, all empires that thought themselves invincible until one day they were not. America right now is in the middle of making one of those historic mistakes. And unless we confront it, this mistake will not only wound us for the next election cycle or the next decade, it will haunt America for generations to come. And what is this mistake? It is the blind, stubborn refusal to face the truth about our economic system. Capitalism, in the form it has taken here in the United States, is hollowing us out from the inside. Instead of being a system that rewards work, it is a system that rewards speculation. Instead of providing stability, it generates crisis after crisis. And instead of building solidarity, it divides us by class, by race, by geography into warring factions. The mistake, the fatal mistake, is pretending that if we just keep tinkering at the edges, if we just elect this politician or pass that tax cut, somehow the system will fix itself. It will not. Let me give you one example. Wages in this country have barely budged for 50 years. 50 years. But productivity, the value of what workers produce, has doubled. Where did all that extra wealth go? Not to you, not to me. It went to the top 1%, who now sit on fortunes so vast that the word obscene doesn't even cover it. The mistake is tolerating an economy where the vast majority struggle paycheck to paycheck while billionaires fly to outer space for sport. And yet, instead of demanding change, we are told be patient, be calm, don't rock the boat. Friends, this boat is sinking, and calmness won't save us. The mistake that stands at the heart of America's looming decline is not hidden, nor is it complicated to understand. It is the refusal, both by our political leaders and by much of the public, to confront the failures of the economic system we live under. This refusal is not a small miscalculation like a tax error or a poor foreign policy decision. It is a structural denial, a turning away from the reality of how our economy operates. And history tells us that when societies refuse to deal with the fundamental truths of their system, they are not merely setting themselves up for temporary setbacks. They are writing the script of their own decline. So I ask you, what happens when a country builds its identity on prosperity and opportunity, but then denies the very forces that are eroding that prosperity every single day? That is the mistake America is making, and it will echo for decades. Think about the last half century. We were told that capitalism, if left to its own devices, would lift all boats, that a rising tide of growth would eventually reach every worker, every family, every community. Yet when wages stopped rising in the 1970s, when households had to send women into the workforce just to make ends meet, when debt exploded because families borrowed desperately to maintain living standards, where was the recognition that something fundamental had gone wrong? Instead of facing the truth, the response was denial. Politicians of both parties promised that growth was just around the corner. Corporations insisted that innovation and globalization would solve everything. And the media, more often than not, echoed the same story. Don't question the system, just wait, just endure, just keep believing. This refusal to confront reality is not just an intellectual mistake, it is a political choice. Because admitting that capitalism has failed to deliver would mean questioning the legitimacy of those who benefit most from it. And those voices, the wealthy, the corporations, the lobbyists, made sure that the system of denial remained intact. But here is the problem: denial does not change reality. it only postpones the reckoning. You can ignore stagnant wages for a decade, maybe even two. You can disguise inequality behind cheap credit and credit cards, behind the illusion of home ownership or the false promise of stock market gains. But eventually, reality asserts itself. And when it does, the damage is far greater than if you had faced the problem head on. Let me give you a hook to think about. Imagine a doctor who refuses to acknowledge a patient's disease. Instead of prescribing treatment, the doctor says, just wait, it will heal itself. At first, maybe the patient believes it. Maybe the symptoms can be ignored or hidden with painkillers. But over time, the disease spreads, grows worse, and by the time the truth is admitted, it is too late for simple remedies. That, my friends, is exactly what the United States is doing with its economic system. The disease is inequality, stagnation, and social division. The painkillers are cheap credit, political rhetoric, and empty promises, and the denial, the refusal to face the truth, will cost us decades of decline. This mistake also feeds into the very divisions tearing our society apart. Because when people are struggling, when they see their lives getting harder, and they are told again and again that everything is fine, they do not simply shrug. They grow angry. They look for explanations. And too often they are handed scapegoats, immigrants, unions, minorities, foreign countries. The refusal to confront the failure of capitalism becomes the breeding ground for social division and political extremism. And instead of solving the problem, we descend into conflict, blaming one another while the real culprit, the system itself, remains untouched. Ask yourself, how long can a society survive when it cannot even name its own problems? How long can we endure a politics that dances around the edges of inequality but refuses to touch its root cause? The answer is not long. And that is why this mistake, the refusal to face the truth about capitalism, is not just another policy error. It is the defining error of our time, and it will shape the future of this country for decades to come. For half a century, the American worker has lived through one of the most astonishing contradictions in economic history. Productivity, the measure of how much value workers create, has more than doubled since the 1970s. Yet wages, adjusted for inflation, have barely moved. Imagine that, a workforce twice as efficient, producing twice as much wealth, and yet their paychecks, their ability to afford homes, education, healthcare, and a secure retirement remain stagnant. That is not simply an economic oddity, it is a betrayal. And it raises the question, if the people who create the wealth are not receiving its rewards, then who is? The answer is clear. Those at the top, the corporations and billionaires who have rigged the system so that the fruits of labor are harvested by the few while the many are left with scraps. This is not just a statistic, it is the core injustice shaping our society. Think about the promises that were made. We were told that if we worked hard, studied, and put in our best effort, we would climb the ladder of prosperity. Yet what happened when productivity surged? Did wages follow? No. Instead, the gains were siphoned off into profits, dividends, and speculative investments. Corporations used the extra wealth not to raise worker pay, but to inflate their stock prices, to buy back their own shares, to enrich executives whose salaries ballooned into the tens of millions. Meanwhile, ordinary workers were told they should be grateful to have a job at all. So let me ask you directly, how sustainable is a society where effort and reward are so completely disconnected? How long can you tell people to work harder, produce more, and yet accept less? The hook here is simple but powerful. When the basic bargain of an economy is broken, the society built upon it begins to crack. Every parent who works two jobs but still cannot afford childcare feels that betrayal. Every graduate saddled with debt, earning less in real terms than their parents did, feels it too. Every worker who looks at soaring corporate profits while their own paycheck barely covers rent understands, consciously or not, that the system is no longer working for them. And this is not a problem of individual failure or lack of effort. It is a systemic design, a deliberate redistribution of wealth upward. What is remarkable is how effectively this reality has been hidden. Politicians speak of growth, of GDP, of stock market highs, as if these are indicators of general prosperity. But GDP can grow while wages stagnate. The stock market can soar while millions struggle to pay medical bills, and productivity can rise while households drown in debt. These measures do not tell the story of the average American life. They tell the story of the corporate balance sheet, the hedge fund, the billionaire portfolio. The mistake is pretending that what is good for them is automatically good for everyone else. History and our own lived experience prove otherwise. Consider the psychological impact of this disconnect. When people realize that their extra effort will not translate into better living standards, motivation erodes, resentment grows, faith in the system collapses. And when a society's workers no longer believe in the promise of progress, when they feel trapped in a rigged game, that is when unrest brews. That is when demagogues step forward with easy scapegoats promising to restore dignity while distracting from the true cause of the problem. This is not a warning from the future. It is happening right now in communities across America, where disillusionment with both political parties grows by the day. And let us not ignore the intergenerational dimension of this betrayal. Young people entering the workforce today are told they must work harder than ever just to reach the same standard of living their parents once enjoyed. But the numbers tell a harsher truth. Housing is less affordable, education costs have skyrocketed, healthcare consumes a larger share of income, and job security has become a relic of the past. At the same time, their productivity, enabled by technology, digital tools, and global markets, is greater than ever. Yet, where are the rewards? Locked away in corporate vaults, redistributed upward in the greatest transfer of wealth in modern history. So the question must be asked, and it is a question with no comfortable answer: how long can this contradiction last? How long can workers continue to produce more and more wealth without sharing in it before the system itself begins to fracture? The lesson from history is that such imbalances do not persist indefinitely. They either lead to reform when societies finally demand change, or they lead to collapse when the tension becomes too great to bear. And right now, America stands at that crossroads, pretending that the problem does not exist, even as the evidence piles up in every paycheck, every bill, every unfulfilled promise. At the core of America's crisis lies an uncomfortable truth. Our economic system has been restructured in a way that rewards speculation over real labor, instability over stability, and division over unity. It is not an accident. It is a feature of how contemporary capitalism in the United States has evolved. When a system places its highest rewards not on those who create goods, teach children, heal the sick, or maintain infrastructure, but instead on those who gamble with money in financial markets, we must ask, what kind of society are we building? And more importantly, how long can that society endure? The hook is clear. If a nation rewards paper profits over real production, crisis becomes not the exception but the rule. Think about what happened in 2008. Millions of Americans lost their homes, their jobs, and their savings because financial institutions had speculated recklessly. They created exotic financial products no worker could understand, bundled toxic assets, and bet against the very economy they claimed to serve. And when it all collapsed, who paid the price? Ordinary Americans. Families thrown into foreclosure, workers forced into unemployment, pensions wiped out. The institutions that caused the disaster were bailed out with public money, while the people who suffered the consequences were left to fend for themselves. That moment revealed the fundamental rot at the heart of the system. Profit is privatized, but losses are socialized. And yet, instead of reforming the system to prevent this from happening again, we doubled down on the very practices that caused the crisis in the first place. The mistake is to think of this as a one-off disaster. In fact, it is the normal operation of a system that prizes speculation. Every bubble, every crash, whether in housing, stocks, or tech, is simply another symptom of an economy that finds quick, speculative profit more attractive than stable, long-term investment in real goods and services. Workers, meanwhile, are told to tighten their belts, to prepare for market corrections, as if the chaos of speculation were a natural phenomenon like the weather, rather than a deliberate design of the system. Ask yourself, what does it mean when the people who build the economy are forced to bear the brunt of its crises, while those who cause them reap the benefits? And there is another layer to this mistake: instability. Capitalism in America does not produce stability. It produces cycles of boom and bust, constant shocks, and uncertainty. For ordinary people, that means a lifetime of insecurity. Never sure if their job will exist next year, never certain if their retirement savings will hold value, always one medical bill or one economic downturn away from disaster. For the wealthy, however, instability is an opportunity. Each crash allows them to buy up assets at bargain prices, consolidating their power even further. What for most Americans is a crisis becomes for the top a lucrative opportunity. The very instability that destroys lives is the foundation of their wealth. Division is the final weapon of this system. When instability creates anger and disillusionment, that anger needs an outlet. Instead of confronting the speculative practices of Wall Street, instead of addressing the structural flaws of capitalism, Americans are encouraged to turn on one another. Workers are divided by race, gender, immigration status, and geography. Rural America is told to blame urban elites. Urban workers are told to resent rural communities. Citizens are taught to suspect immigrants, to distrust unions, to envy government workers. These divisions are not accidents, they are strategies. They keep workers too fragmented to organize collectively, too distracted to challenge the true beneficiaries of the system. Here's a hook worth holding on to. Instability and division are not unfortunate side effects. They are the glue that holds the system together. If workers were united, if they recognized that speculation is enriching a few while destabilizing the many, the demand for systemic change would be overwhelming. But by keeping people divided and fearful, the system protects itself. It convinces Americans that their struggles are personal failings or the fault of their neighbors rather than the predictable outcome of an economy that prioritizes speculative profit over social well-being. The deeper tragedy is that this rot does not just harm the economy, it corrodes the culture and the politics of the nation. Trust in institutions collapses when instability is constant. Communities fracture when division is normalized. Hope is replaced by cynicism when people realize that no matter how hard they work, the game is rigged. And in that vacuum of trust, opportunists thrive, politicians who promise easy answers, corporations that offer false solutions, and media outlets that profit from fear and outrage. This is not just an economic issue, it is the soil in which extremism and despair take root. So when we say the American economy rewards speculation over labor, instability over stability, and division over unity, we are not describing abstract economic forces. We are describing the lived reality of millions of Americans whose lives have been destabilized, divided, and exploited for decades. And until we recognize that this is not a flaw, but the very design of the system, the crises will not stop. They will deepen, and the people will be left asking again and again why the wealth they create never seems to find its way back to them. History is not silent about the dangers of inequality. Again and again, empires that once seemed unshakable collapsed, not because an enemy stormed their gates, but because the rot inside their societies made them fragile. Rome did not fall simply because of invading tribes. It collapsed because corruption, inequality, and neglect hollowed it out. The British Empire, which once stretched across the globe, lost its grip when it could no longer sustain the contradictions between its wealth at the top and its poverty at the base. Spain, once the richest power in Europe, squandered its gold on wars and elite luxuries while its people starved. The pattern is familiar. Societies that fail to address internal inequality weaken themselves until collapse becomes inevitable. The hook is unavoidable. When a nation refuses to take care of its own, it need a foreign enemy to bring it down. It will unravel from within. Now look at the United States through this lens. Today, America is more unequal than at any time since the Gilded Age. The top 1% controls more wealth than the entire bottom half of the population combined. Billionaires have fortunes so vast they cannot spend them in 10 lifetimes, while millions of families are one missed paycheck away from eviction. And yet, just as in past empires, those in power insist that this imbalance is not only tolerable but a sign of strength. They tell us inequality is the price of progress, as though leaving millions in poverty while a handful live in palaces were a sign of greatness rather than decay. Consider how societies rot under such conditions. Inequality eats away at trust in institutions, trust in leaders, trust in the very idea of fairness. When citizens see politicians bending laws to serve the wealthy, when they see corporations evade taxes while workers shoulder the burden, they lose faith in the system. Without trust, the bonds that hold society together fray. People stop believing that hard work leads to opportunity, and they begin to wonder whether the entire structure is rigged against them. And when that belief takes hold, history shows us the outcome is never stability. It is unrest, rebellion, and collapse. Here is a hook worth pausing on. No wall, no army, no military budget, no matter how large, can defend a nation against the corrosive effects of internal inequality. America spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Yet, what use is that power if the real threat is not outside its borders, but inside its communities? Empty factories, shuttered schools, crumbling infrastructure, and families pushed into poverty by medical bills and unaffordable housing. These are the enemies hollowing out America. Like Rome's neglected provinces, like Britain's impoverished industrial towns, America's own neglected people are the clearest sign of decline. And the parallels extend even further. Empires collapse not just from economic inequality, but from the cultural and political divisions it breeds. When wealth pools at the top, the elite become detached from the reality of everyday life. They live in separate neighborhoods, send their children to private schools, and receive health care far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Over time, they begin to view themselves as a different class altogether, above accountability, above responsibility, above the rest of society. Meanwhile, the masses feel abandoned, alienated, and resentful. That gap between rulers who are detached and ruled who feel ignored has destroyed more empires than any invading army. And what of politics? Inequality distorts democracy itself. When wealth translates directly into political power through campaign donations, lobbying, and media ownership, the majority finds its voice drowned out. Decisions that should serve the public instead serve the wealthy few. This is not democracy in any meaningful sense. It is oligarchy disguised as democracy. And once people recognize that their votes no longer shape their futures, they disengage. Voter turnout declines, cynicism deepens, and into that vacuum step opportunists promising easy answers. This too is the trajectory of empires in decline. The great mistake America is making is believing it can escape the lessons of history. We tell ourselves we are exceptional, that what destroyed Rome or Britain cannot happen here. But the truth is brutal. No society in human history has survived long term when inequality became this extreme. Wealth gaps of this magnitude are not sustainable. They tear apart the social fabric, they poison the political process, and they weaken the very foundations of national power. America is not immune. The signs are already visible. Communities abandoned, politics consumed by division, young generations losing hope in a system that offers them less than their parents had. So when we look at the history of fallen empires, we should not see them as distant lessons. We should see them as mirrors, reflecting the choices America is making today. And the warning is clear. If inequality continues to widen, if corruption and neglect deepen, then the collapse will not come from an enemy abroad, but from the mistakes festering within. The question is not whether this pattern applies to us, but how long we can ignore it before the weight of our own contradictions brings us down. Young people in America today are growing up in an environment that is profoundly different from what their parents and grandparents experienced. For decades, the promise was simple: work hard, get an education, and you will have a secure future. That promise has been broken. Instead of opportunity, younger generations inherit debt, instability, and disillusionment. They see a nation that can spend trillions on wars and corporate bailouts, but tells its students that free education is impossible. They see politicians boast about stock market highs while young families cannot afford a home. They see immigrants arrive with dreams of a better life, only to be met with poverty wages, overcrowded housing, and a healthcare system that fails them in moments of greatest need. This is not the vision of a thriving society. It is the slow collapse of faith in the American dream. And here is the hook. When a generation stops believing in the future of their own country, that country is already in crisis. Consider what happens when an entire generation begins its adult life burdened by student debt. Instead of saving for a home or building a family, young workers spend decades paying off loans. This debt acts like an anchor, dragging down not only individual lives, but the entire economy as consumer spending and investment stall. Meanwhile, the jobs awaiting them are often insecure, temporary, or underpaid. So-called gig economy offers flexibility, but at the cost of stability. No benefits, no pensions, no guarantees. In effect, Young Americans are being asked to work harder than ever, for less security than ever, while carrying heavier financial burdens than any generation before them. What message does that send about the future? Immigrants, too, were once told that America was the land of endless opportunity. For many, that dream drew them across oceans and borders, yet what they find on arrival is too often a system designed to exploit their labor without offering security in return. They become the backbone of industries from agriculture to construction to healthcare, yet they remain marginalized, underpaid, and often denied the rights and protections extended to others. The contradiction is stark. America needs their labor but refuses to value their lives. The myth of opportunity shatters quickly in the face of poverty, wages, and systemic neglect. And when immigrants lose faith in the very dream that brought them here, it signals a deeper failure of the nation itself. Whole regions of the country reflect this abandonment. Once vibrant towns across the Midwest and South have seen factories close, jobs vanish, and schools shutter. Communities hollow out as young people leave in search of opportunities that no longer exist at home. Rural hospitals close at alarming rates, leaving entire counties without access to health care. Infrastructure crumbles, and local governments struggle to provide even basic services. These are not isolated tragedies, they are part of a broader pattern of economic abandonment, and each neglected town, each struggling community is another thread unraveling in the fabric of the nation. The psychological toll is enormous. When young people look ahead and see only debt and instability, when immigrants realize they are valued only as cheap labor, when entire regions are left behind, hope erodes. And once hope is gone, cynicism takes its place. You hear it in the way young Americans speak about politics, dismissing both major parties as corrupt or irrelevant. You see it in declining voter turnout, in the rise of despair-related deaths, in the growing sense that the system is rigged and cannot be fixed. A society that cannot offer hope to its young people is a society on borrowed time. Here is the uncomfortable truth. A dream deferred does not simply vanish quietly. It transforms into anger, frustration, and resistance. History shows that when generations feel cheated, when immigrants feel betrayed, when communities feel abandoned, they eventually demand change, sometimes through reform, sometimes through unrest. The United States is reaching such a tipping point. The disillusionment of today's youth, the exploitation of immigrants, and the neglect of entire regions are not separate crises. They are symptoms of the same fundamental mistake, prioritizing profit over people. The warning signs are everywhere. Polls show younger generations are more skeptical of capitalism than any in American history. Immigrants increasingly question whether the sacrifices they make are worth it. Rural and post-industrial communities no longer believe they have a place in the national future. These are not minor grumblings, they are profound shifts in belief, and they reveal a society losing its narrative, its shared sense of purpose. And once a nation loses that, decline is not just possible, it is inevitable. The tragedy is not only economic, but generational. America is squandering its greatest resource, the energy, creativity, and hope of its people. Instead of cultivating them, it burdens them. Instead of nurturing their dreams, it stifles them. And when the young no longer believe in the system, when immigrants stop seeing this country as a land of opportunity, when entire communities feel discarded, the future of the nation itself is thrown into question. That is the cost of neglect, and it is a cost that will echo for decades. The choice facing America today is stark and unavoidable. Either we continue down the current path, clinging to a system that concentrates wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands, or we embrace a fundamental change that democratizes the workplace, redistributes wealth, and places human needs above corporate profits. This is not a matter of ideology, it is a matter of survival. A society cannot endure when the majority see their lives worsening while a small elite flourishes beyond imagination. The hook is simple but piercing. If America refuses to make this choice, the choice will be made for it in the form of decline, instability, and social fracture. Consider what democratizing the workplace would mean. For generations, decisions about production, investment, and wages have been made almost exclusively by a small group of executives and shareholders. Workers, the very people whose labor produces the wealth, are excluded from these decisions, treated as costs to be minimized rather than partners in building prosperity. Imagine instead an economy where workers collectively decide how their enterprises operate, where profits are reinvested in communities, where dignity and fairness are built into the workplace. Such a model is not utopian. It exists in worker cooperatives around the world, and studies show they are often more stable and more equitable than traditional firms. The mistake is believing that the current model is the only possible one. Wealth redistribution is another element of the choice before us. Today, inequality has reached levels so extreme that it threatens the very cohesion of the nation. A handful of billionaires own more wealth than entire populations, while millions cannot afford basic health care or housing. Tax policies have been deliberately structured to favor those at the top, with loopholes and shelters that ordinary people could never dream of accessing. To reverse this requires courage, the courage to tax wealth, to close corporate loopholes, to invest not in endless wars, but in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Without such measures, inequality will continue to widen, pulling the country further apart. Here is the hook. Redistribution is not about punishing success. It is about preserving society. History shows that when wealth is hoarded by the few, the many eventually rise in anger. Redistribution is not charity, it is insurance against collapse. It is a recognition that no individual creates wealth alone, that every fortune is built on the labor, infrastructure, and resources of society as a whole. Refusing to redistribute is not only unjust, it is reckless. Placing human need above corporate profit is the final essential choice. Today, corporate decisions are judged by a single measure: profitability. If cutting jobs, outsourcing work, or raising prices boosts the bottom line, it is deemed a success, even if it devastates communities and families. But what if we measured success differently? What if we asked whether economic activity improves healthcare outcomes, strengthens education, builds housing, or protects the environment? Profit is not irrelevant, but it should not be the sole compass guiding the economy. By prioritizing people over profit, we begin to repair the social fabric that decades of corporate dominance have torn apart. The tragedy is that America has been convinced there is no alternative. We are told again and again that this is the best system possible, that reform will stifle innovation, that redistribution will kill growth, that democratizing the workplace is unrealistic. Yet these claims are less about truth than about preserving the privileges of those who benefit from the status quo. The real question is not whether change is possible, but whether survival is possible without change. Look around at the consequences of refusing this choice. Political polarization deepens as people search for answers in the absence of real solutions. Economic insecurity fuels resentment and despair. Trust in institutions collapses, leaving space for demagogues who exploit fear and division. All of these are symptoms of a nation that has delayed its reckoning for too long. And the longer we delay, the narrower our options become. Here is the harshest hook of all: decline is not inevitable, but it is a choice. To continue business as usual is to choose decline, to act boldly, to democratize, to redistribute, to prioritize human need is to choose survival and renewal. No empire is ever endured by ignoring its people, and America will not be the first. The path is still open, but the window is closing. The question is whether we have the courage to walk through it before it slams shut. Let me leave you with this. The story I've laid out is not one of doom for its own sake. It is a warning, and warnings are meant to wake us up. America is at a crossroads, and the stakes could not be higher. We have made mistakes of denial, of allowing stagnant wages while productivity soared, of rewarding speculation instead of labor, of ignoring the lessons of history's fallen empires, of betraying our young people, immigrants, and entire regions, and of refusing to make the fundamental choice between profit and people. Each of these mistakes is serious enough on its own. Taken together, they form a crisis that will shape this nation for decades. But here is the truth: decline is not destiny. Mistakes can be corrected, systems can be reformed, societies can choose another path. What is required is the courage to confront the reality of our situation and the imagination to see alternatives where those in power insist none exist. We can democratize the workplace. We can redistribute wealth in ways that strengthen, not weaken, society. We can place human need above corporate greed. These are not fantasies, they are necessities if America is to endure. The hook I want you to carry with you is simple. No empire falls because it had too much justice, too much equality, or too much democracy. They fall because they lack those things. And if America fails to learn that lesson, if we continue to tolerate inequality, exploitation, and neglect, then we will be writing our own obituary. But if we rise to the moment, if we refuse the lie that there is no alternative, then we may yet transform this crisis into a new beginning. The choice is ours. The future is ours. But only if we are willing to face the truth and act with the urgency that this moment demands.